This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Sketchup, a 3D Toolbox. I'm Cameron Harris, and this is episode number 12. Today we're talking about groups, which are sort of a feature of Sketchup that makes modeling easier, but doesn't actually affect your model visibly. You see, if something is ungrouped, then it has a tendency to be very difficult to select for one thing, but also difficult to maneuver within your model because it tends to stick to other elements that aren't ungrouped. When something is grouped, however, it's all packaged up in its own nice little bundle. Let me show you how they work. So I've got my SketchUp project open here, and this is a little bit more complex than ones that we've been working with before. Here I've got two cubes of equal size and one smaller cube. And I'm going to, the first thing I'm going to do is do things the way we have been doing them in previous episodes, and showing why that isn't really the best way to do it. It's the best way to go if you're just experimenting with something or building a single element, but if you're doing something where you're combining multiple elements together, you really need to start learning about groups, and that's what we're going to do today. So let's start by moving this cube, this smaller cube right here, on top of this larger one. Stack the two. So the way I can do that is I can just select this cube here by just triple clicking on it. Remember, triple click selects everything connected to it. And I'll just use the move tool, M for the move tool, grab the corner down here, and you notice that as I move it up on top of it, of the larger cube, it automatically snaps so that it's on, just sitting right on top of that face. So I'll just set it down somewhere in the middle, click somewhere else with the selection tool to deselect. And you can see that looks very nice. It looks like it's sitting right on top of it, which it is. But the difficulty comes when we want to move this. So let's start, first of all, by trying to select it. So let's say we want to move this off of the larger. We think, no, we don't really want to have that stacked on there anymore. Let's move it off to the side. So you might think, well, I'll just triple click it again, right? Uh-oh, what's happening here? Well, keep in mind, triple click selects everything that is connected to the point that you clicked. And you notice now that this smaller cube is sitting right on top of the larger cube. The lines of the smaller cube are intersecting with the face of the larger cube. You can see right there, they pretty much are considered the same object by SketchUp now. So triple clicking doesn't work, double clicking doesn't do enough, and single clicking certainly doesn't do enough. So really the only thing it's left to do is just shift click to select multiple faces and lines and just keep going until you've selected the whole cube, which you can do, but to be honest with you, that is a huge pain. I mean, you can see I'm just about halfway through, and it's already taking me about 30 seconds just to move a simple cube. Imagine if this was a more complex object, or even a separate model. So now I've got the whole cube selected. Let's try and move it off. So that actually works okay, but oh dear, what's happening now? As I try to move it up and off of this thing, look at that. It's kind of, I mean, it's a cool effect. It kind of looks like a chimney now, but it's sticking. I can't get it off of the cube. That's because once two objects touch in SketchUp, if they are not their own elements, which these two aren't, they're just raw edges and faces at this point. If they're just in that raw form, the instant they touch, it's like they're glued. I can now, it's basically impossible now to get this cube off of this larger cube intact. So I mean, I can absolutely like just select this stuff and just, delete all of it, and I'll be left with just the larger cube. But if I want to just separate the two and not delete one of them, well, I'm pretty much out of luck. It's going to be really difficult, nigh impossible to do that. And it gets even more difficult if you're doing something like this. Let's say I bump these two things up against each other. Let's pretend that each one of these two cubes is a room, And now I've got these two rooms linked together. Say I'm building a house. So now I've got these two rooms here. They link up together very nicely. But, oh, didn't really want that room there. Let's try moving the room onto the other side. Well, good luck with that. Even if I use if I use Shift double click, and Shift triple click also work to select multiple. I mean, obviously Shift click to select individual elements, but if I Shift double click, I'll select that face and all of its surrounding edges. Same stuff that we've been learning about, just selecting multiple things at once. But even with those tricks, it is still going to take a long time to select all this stuff, and once you do, you try and move it off. Look at that. It just expands the other one to fit it. It's like it's glued to that face, and it's like stretching this whole thing out. If this is what you're going for, by all means, go right ahead. But chances are it's not. And I mean, you can get some pretty weird looking stuff. I mean, look at what's happening there and there. It's just, it is really kind of messed up. We'll just do escape to stop doing that. Groups are essential to building things in SketchUp if you're doing multiple elements. And I mean, right now we're just stacking cubes, and it's like, you know, that's very simple. But imagine, if you will, that you had something like a room and you were trying to rearrange furniture. If the furniture is glued to the floor and the floor comes with the furniture as you're moving it, it's going to be impossible to not end up with a room that looks like you're in the middle of a fun house. I mean, everything is going to be warped and distorted, and it's going to be incredibly time consuming to select all the individual faces and lines of those pieces of furniture. That's why groups are crucial. So let me show you what groups are. A group is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of like if you're on a computer, you have a folder, and within that folder you have all your individual files. If you just drag that folder somewhere else, all the files come along with it. So it's a similar thing in SketchUp. It's like you're making a folder, almost, of all your 3D elements. So the way you group something in SketchUp is by selecting that which you want to make a group. So let's start by making this small cube here a group. I can just triple click it as if I was going to move it, just select the whole thing. And make sure you do select the whole thing. If you, for example, didn't select that line right there, you want to make sure that they're all blue. That means they're selected. But if it's not and you made a group, well, then that line will not be included in the group. So you want to make sure that you want to have all that selected. And then the easiest way to make a group is to right-click on the selected object, not off in here. If you right-click off in space, nothing really happens. We'll make sure you right-click on the selected portion. Right-clicking or holding down the Control key and clicking will also work. Just right-click, and you get this little pop-up with all these different options here. Now, there's a lot here, and we're going to be talking about all of these things in future episodes, but the one that we really want to focus on here is this one right down here. It says Make Group. Highlight that, click it, and now you notice that the selection box around the cube has changed slightly. You notice that, for one thing, the faces aren't covered with those little blue scatters of dots. So like, you'll notice if I click on this face here, kind of gets a little bit of a shading thing going on there. If I click on this one here, nothing. And all I'm doing here, keep in mind, is I'm just clicking once on this cube, and just clicking once selects the whole thing because it's a group. A group is treated as its own single element. Clicking on a group once selects that entire group. And you'll also notice that the selection box around it is actually slightly bigger than the cube itself. There's a little bit of space around it. That's normal. That's not to say that it's increased the size of it or anything like that. That's just kind of a difference in the way you view groups rather than individual elements. So that's very nice. But what's incredibly powerful about groups is that you can use the Move tool, grab a corner, like all the snapping features still work. Grab a corner, grab a midpoint, grab an edge. I'll just grab this corner right here. Let's stack it on top of this cube here again. Now this cube, this big cube, isn't a group, keep in mind. Two groups will do the same thing as this, but it doesn't have to be two groups. Just one of these elements have to be groups. Stick it on there. Click off. And you see, nothing is different than what we were doing before. they're still stacked right on top of each other. They're still, if you get down at this level, they're still intersecting just right exactly at that face. Nothing has changed, but if I don't want the cube there anymore, I just click it once. So already a huge time saver, not having to select the whole thing. Grab it, move it off. Move it up, move it down, move it wherever I want, and it's not glued. Groups are not sticky, is the best way to describe it. And the same thing goes even if both of these things are groups. So if I make a group out of this cube here, right-click, make group, I get the same exact thing, and now I can move this guy around wherever I want, even intersect him with this cube right here, and nothing happens. I can still move it out. I can still move this cube out. Triple clicking on this cube will still select only that cube. Now that's an interesting thing to point out, is that groups that are connected to other raw elements like this, triple clicking on this raw element, this raw cube here, will not select that group because a group doesn't connect to anything else. It can look like it's connected to something else, but it's its own individual element. So I would just have to shift click on it to include it in my selection. But then I can just, drag this guy off here, and it's all good. Now, that's all well and good, but there are some things you have to think about with groups, and that one of the things is that what happens if you want to change this. Like you'll notice, like let's say, for example, we wanted to use the push-pull tool to make this cube taller. How can we do that? Well, you notice that we can't select an individual face anymore. If we go over it with the push-pull tool, we just get that little slashy icon because we're not selecting a raw face. It's been grouped. So you might think that once you group something, it's kind of like it's baked. You've stuck it in the oven, you've baked the cake, you can't change it anymore. Well, that is not true. It's not that inflexible. What's really awesome about Sketchup is, what do you do if you want to edit the contents of a folder on your computer? You double-click the folder. Double-click the group. And now you're back in your raw edit mode. But you notice everything else in the model has been grayed out, or it's kind of all got this kind of greenish cast to it. And I can, click on them, but once I do, I'm back in my old view where I'm outside of the group. Double-clicking on a group kind of enters that group, and now I can edit it. So let's say I wanted to make this a little bit taller. Now all I have to do is just click somewhere else, somewhere other than the group, deselect it, and I'm out. It's that easy to edit these things. And this is really the best way to work in SketchUp. Now, here's something else that's pretty cool. Let's say I've got this group here, and I've got this group here. Let's say I move this guy right there. These are both groups. So I can, move them apart and, elsewhere. They're not going to get stuck or cause any problems with each other. They're not going to interfere with each other because they're their own individual elements, but I can still group them even further. So I've got a group here and a group here. I can select both groups holding down the shift key to make multiple selections. I now have both of them selected. Right click on them, make group. And now I've got this thing here. Now you notice that it's got a box around the whole thing. It doesn't just outline each of the individual lines. It's just a big cube that kind of contains the whole thing, even if there's there's nothing in this space, but it's using the selection things to show you because this is sticking out further. It's going to expand the selection box to include that. That's not to say that there's an invisible box there that's going to interfere with everything else. That's just a little selection indicator. But now, click once, I've selected that, and I can move this group around. Just clicking once and moving it around moves both of those elements because those individual elements have been combined into one individual element now. And again, the editing still works. I can double click on this group, and now I can select the individual groups. I can double click on this group and enter into that, and I can just drill down my selection. This is very, very powerful because I can extend this out now and extend this out. I click elsewhere, I exit out of that group, I click elsewhere again, I exit out of that group, and now this group here has been updated. This is incredibly powerful. So oftentimes you'll have, just groups within groups within groups. Oftentimes what I'll do is I'll say I'm building a simple room. I'll build the room and make that a group. Then I'll start building, adding furniture. And each of those individual furniture pieces will be their own groups. And then I'll add windows and doors. Those will be their own groups. And then I'll keep grouping everything. And I'll group the furniture and the floor together. And I'll group the windows and the doors together. And all this stuff. And you can just drill down until you get to the one you want. Make your changes. Click elsewhere to get out of it. And now everything is its own individual element. I can make any changes I want, and it's very simple to move them around wherever I want without them having to stick to everything else. But, again, you might think that this is also a little bit limiting because I can't ungroup things, can I? If you right-click, you don't see an ungroup thing. You see edit group, but that's just does the same thing as double-clicking. Doesn't really help you very much. There's no ungroup command here. Well, that seems very odd. Once you group something, is it a one-way road? Can you not go back? Say I wanted these two cute blocks to be their own individual elements again rather than just one. What do I do then? Well, there actually is a command for it, and for some reason it's not called the ungroup command, which would make more sense, to me at least. Instead, it is actually called, if you right-click on the group, it's called explode. It's right here. It's called explode. And if you select it, then those groups are split apart. So now they're their own individual elements again. But it only ungrouped that particular group. It didn't ungroup everything within it. These are still their own groups. If I wanted to ungroup this, I could just say explode on that, and now I'm back down to the raw lines and edges. Or lines and faces, excuse me. Why it's called the explode command, I have no clue. But, it kind of makes sense. You're kind of exploding a group into its own individual pieces, except that the pieces stay together. It's a little bit strange. Now, keep in mind that if I were to explode this group, for example, now I have no groups. These things are both their individual raw elements, and I'm now back to the painful selection and impossible to move mode. This is kind of where you don't want to be because it's going to be extremely difficult to get yourself out of it. So like, for example, if I try and select all these things and just to make it a group again, let's say that I've gone and done some other stuff, I can't just undo it. Theoretically, you can just select the lines and faces that make up that block and then right-click on them again and say make group, but you might get results that you weren't expecting because it's connected to this other group. So like now it's its own group, I can drag it out, but oh dear, it's left behind some of itself that I wasn't able to select because it was up against the other thing. You can see it's lost its end cap there, and that end cap is still firmly stuck over here onto this one. So you got to be careful. What I typically do is I will construct my individual elements somewhere other than my main model. So let's say I had my room in one part of my model. Say that this was my room here, a very bizarre room, I'll give you that, but let's pretend this was my room, and I wanted to build a simple chair for it. I would build the chair over here in empty space so that it won't be interfered with anything and it won't be interfering with anything. I would build it over here, go ahead and make it a group, and then drag it in and place it where I want. I would not keep it in its raw line and face mode. So that's what I would do. You might have a slightly different workflow, but I'm pretty much going to guarantee you that your workflow will contain groups in some form or fashion. So as you can see, groups are really useful. Not only do they make it easier to move things around, but also makes it easier to select and even delete objects, as well as just kind of keep your model very organized and easy to manage. So that's it for this episode. We're going to start a new series next week. We're actually going to start modeling a room, step by step, from the walls to the floor to the windows to the furniture. In the meantime, though, you can check us out online at www.harwoodpodcast.com. There we have the show notes, the forums, all that good stuff. And if you have any questions or comments for me, feel free to send me an email at harwoodpodcast@comcast.net. Until next time, I'll just say goodbye and good modeling.